Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 7. Tidings from Frain's Point. Melvor was not one to hesitate. Always sure of his course, he had never had a reason, at least not since that fateful day when he had been forced to choose between affection and duty. No, it had been more than mere affection. He had loved his son deeply, enough to take his place in the fire, and yet this had not deterred him from doing what was right. But it had caused him to hesitate. It was a strange thing, then, that he appeared so indecisive now that definite action was called for. But how could one act when the course ahead had become so ambiguous? He cleared his throat. The people of Breck, of Lysann, from its nobles to the lowest street urchin, awaited his next words. Melvor spoke with the confidence he no longer felt.
Good people of Breck, your time of uncertainty is over. From this day forward, you will be subjects of the King of Nuria.
He waited for possible cheers. There were none. Only shocked surprise not even the most diplomatic noble could hide. He continued hastily.
A lord from Nuria will be appointed in place of the departed Ligurian governor. Until that time, I will govern the province in the name of the king.
He looked at the nobles in turn. His next statement would please them.
The special Ligurian war tax is cancelled forthwith.
There were smiles now, as he knew there would be. A ragged cheer broke from the crowd. It was worth the gamble. If Lucane wanted to reinstitute the tax, he could be the unpopular one. He raised a hand.
And no, if you have already paid for this season, you cannot claim it back.
There was some laughter. He was winning them over for the moment. This was essential if he were at least to make an attempt at executing the instructions from Talon.
I cannot speak for the wise and kind lords who will come after me, but while I am in control of this city and the land round it, of this I can assure you, there will be an immediate concerted effort made to rid every highway, every road, and every lane of the raiding bandits infesting your country.
There were more cheers, genuine at least to some degree. These folks had seen many promises made and broken during the last few seasons. Perhaps they had been softened enough for the blow to come.
There will be a muster of every able-bodied male above 14 cycles.
There was an angry gasp from the crowd, scowls and downcast eyes.
But these recruits will only be employed to guard this city and the towns of Lysann. As Nurian subjects, you will get a taste of what a real king can do. You will be entitled to the protection of the Nurian forces, and will be treated with the respect Nurians enjoy from their neighbors. This city will be built up once more, its fortifications brought on a par with the great cities of the north. The borders of your land will be patrolled and secured against incursions from the desert or the marshlands.
People were listening now, some grudgingly, but most with interest. They had always been in a difficult position, situated among more powerful neighbors, the subject of dispute and armed struggle. If becoming a Nurian province would rid them of this in-between status, it might not be such a bad thing. Melvor was willing to promise them anything he could think of. In the end he even opened the palace doors for a festival of sorts, and declared a holiday, as one would after a great victory or liberation. For the commoner, the tradesman, the casual trader or farmer, Nurian rule would sit much better on a full stomach and plenty of ale. It was probably more than they ever received from their former king, or the Ligurian governor for that matter. Once the city was drinking to Fengor's health at the king's own expense, Melvor could slip away to measure the success of his day's toil in private. The crafty Burr merchant Hassar was the first to report. He knew his opinion was valued above every other spy in the captain's employ.
A most impressive speech, Marish, but I find it surprising that the Nurian king would be so generous to his poor subjects in the far south.
Melvor looked at him askance.
Let's just say that the king's captain was a little more generous than his master would be.
The merchant's smile was wider than ever.
May I congratulate the captain on his generosity, for it has won him many friends in the city this day. Long may the effects of it last, against the appetites of his less worthy superiors.
He bowed low.
With the greatest respect, of course.
Melvor leaned forward.
There will be no resistance to the master?
Very little, I suspect. As long as you can keep to the bargain and not send these men to foreign battles.
Melvor nodded.
My instructions are to raise the soldiers here, but only the Nurians will go to Ligerium.
Hassar smiled.
That is wise.
Melvor's trust had made him loose-tongued. Karth would be delighted with the news.
But it would be even wiser for you to remain in the city, Maresh, when the trouble starts. They trust you.
He waited tensely for Melvor to step in the trap. The captain shook his head.
No, that will not be possible. At least not till after the men are settled outside Nicoma.
He reached a hand to his chin.
I would have to oversee the fortification of Breck personally, though. One could not trust this lot to do it properly.
Did the noble king of Nuria, Imran bless and keep him, really give instructions for the building of proper walls here in the south?
Melvor was lost in thought, hardly aware of Hassar's presence.
No, but I will not be held responsible for the charge of a city when it cannot be defended. Lysan will have at least one stronghold.
Melvor knew that he was crawling out on a thin and fragile limb. He consoled himself that he was taking risks because they had given him risky instructions. The fortification of Breck would take much more than mere words and resolutions, though. With the war taxes gone, he would have to use Nurian letters of credit, issued in the king's name, if contractors were to bring stone from the mountain quarries, and laborers start work with what was available already. In the end, he might be the sole party responsible for the new prosperity in Lysan. He had also taken liberties with the truth, but there was no way out of the dilemma if he could not count on the cooperation of the people of Lysan. How was he to hold the place when all the Nurian soldiers sat on the border of Ligerium? Had Fengor's strategies turned to complete folly? Perhaps because there was so little to be done in terms of work, Hikan's house did not wake till dawn. At the first change of the guard, a great metal dish was struck repeatedly in the inner courtyard, announcing to the inhabitants of the extensive sleeping quarters that it was time to commence the structured inactivity of yet another day. Soon the servants would be scurrying about, delivering messages, confirming appointments already twice confirmed, darting to the side of a mistress in need of more salts for her morning bath. All the frantic activity created the impression that there were far more important matters unfolding than the mere pampering of the already over-pampered nymphs of Hikan's garden. Slowly, as if emerging from a rhyme-song sleep, regal as so many queens, the collection of concubines would make their way to perfumed, shaded salons, where they would break their fast with dainties carted all the way from Jewel. It was advisable to fortify oneself properly for the exhausting rounds of visiting and gossip that could well last for the entire day. Haldred found herself the center of not altogether benevolent attention. She privately dreaded receiving an invitation from the more settled members of the house, since a visit with one of them always turned out to be a mere satisfying of hostile curiosity, an evaluation of the threat she posed to their respective positions in the master's esteem. Had they but known how averse she was to any approaches from the man, they would have treated her with more civility and less suspicion. At least Hekan had been as good as his word. Arid lived in the servants' quarters with Maris, close by. She saw him every day and tried to comfort him as best she could. He was bewildered and frightened, even though there was enough food now and clean clothes to wear. The nightmare of Julos' death and the ordeal that followed were still fresh in his memory. She was relieved to have Maris within reach. The boy clung to him for security, as he probably had during the journey without his mother, and afterwards in the horror of their canvas prison. The presence of the youth in the house also made her feel less isolated. It had been worth the risk of stretching Hekan's favor to bring him out of the slave pens. She had been correct in her assumption that the desert lord did not pay much attention to the household slaves. He would hardly notice a new face. Hekan Seer spent much time away from the canvas city at Frain's Point. After Haldred's initial encounter with him, he was absent for more than a 10-day. It was a relief, she told herself, though her privileged position here and the safety of her son depended entirely upon his good favor. She dreaded the day he would finally send for her and claim his self-awarded rights. A stir of excitement greeted the master's return. Each of the women secretly hoped to be the one summoned to his tent in the evening, and vied with one another in their provocative dressing and lavish application of perfumes and spices from the east. Venomous looks darted this way and that during supper, the only lively conversation occurring among old friends and allies. The younger girls tittered uncontrollably, looking about them in nervous contempt, their cheeks flushed and their eyes sparkling. It was amazing that all this excitement and effort would be entirely wasted on Hekan. He would make his choice without seeing a single one. Cura's eyes betrayed the news. Haldred felt the shadow fall over her, making it suddenly difficult to breathe, even before the girl opened her mouth to speak the dreaded words. She was to prepare herself. The master wanted to see her that very night. The air inside her tent was oppressive. It had not cooled as usual this evening. In the distance there was a deep rumble. She thought of the poor wretches who had to step into the arena in Arius to face the wild animals. Was this what they felt like, knowing their time had come and there was no escape? The chamberlain appeared. Servants scurried in with oils and perfumes. One draped a flowing garment over a stool, while others helped her out of the one she was wearing. Practiced hands closed in on her, two girls working on her hair alone, till she stood prepared for her trial. A gilded band held back her brushed and perfumed hair. A necklace of brilliant emerald stones, set in gold, was placed round her neck, and a woman with face paint set to work to enhance any striking feature and disguise those considered less so. They carefully draped her in the wine-red garment they had brought. It was not of any style even the licentious Ligurian court trollops would have recognized. It left her feeling utterly exposed, even though it reached nearly to the floor. The material was soft, but very insubstantial, even transparent, and the cut left her sides bare. Moreover, they had tied the hem to her ankles, so that the greater part of her leg was exposed through the side slit as she walked. When finally Cura held the mirror so that she may admire herself in it, she gave a little cry of distress. She did not have the appearance of royalty anymore. She was dressed like a harlot from the docks of Arois. Bad weather was brewing somewhere over the desert, the roll of thunder drawing closer. Hikan was dressed in a flowing gown of sky-blue silk. He reclined on his favorite chaise, while two servants slowly moved the sultry air about him with feathered fronds. He opened his mouth from time to time, inserting a grape or some similar delicacy. At her appearance, through the curtained doorway, he leaned back and smiled. Aldred felt the nervousness grip her stomach till it was as tight as a bowstring. She was unbearably aware of her scantily clad body, and the flowery perfume flowing about her as an added irritating intoxicant. She could not deny having had dreams as a girl similar to what was about to transpire, and perhaps even since her unhappy union with Julos. But here and now this indulgent fancy became a repulsive sacrifice. Hikan was not an unseemly man, but she knew that his supple form hid the blackest of hearts. The thought of his hands on her made her shudder. She held her head high as he looked her over. She was the daughter of a king, and he a vile murderer. Hikan frowned and placed an index finger on his pursed lips. Her thoughts were disgustingly obvious to him, a man who prided himself on his vast experience with women of every temperament imaginable. He made a quick decision.
No, I liked you much better when you arrived here, all tearful and groveling. You will not please me tonight.
His voice was haughty and carefully toned to express professional boredom.
Nigerian women are overrated. They are too proud or too loose, always in the extreme. You have to coax them or rein them in. Tonight, I want none of that. Go back to your place and wait.
Aldred's impassive air hid the tremendous relief she felt. The impossible reprieve had come. To others in the harem, this would be the supreme shame. To her, it was an answered prayer. Taking care not to change her facial expression, she bowed deeply and backed out of the room. Hikan had already snapped his fingers at another servant and whispered new instructions in his ear. Safely back in her tent, Aldred tremblingly removed the jewelry and costume. She found water in a washing bowl and scrubbed the oil and powder from her face. For someone who had never begged the silent gods for favors, she now whispered her thanks to the unknown deity who had watched out for her this night. Cura was nowhere to be found. Not expecting her back so early, the girl had to have gone out to meet one of her friends, no doubt to boast a little over the supposed success this night would have brought. Though Aldred was fond of her, it was a relief not to have her around at that moment. She was not sure if she could pretend to be disappointed just now. A brilliant flash outside lit up the tent. Moments later, a tremendous crash shook the night. Aldred turned away from it, doused the single lamp, and slipped into her bed. Maris spoke in low tones, barely audible from where Aldred sat with her back to the crates that hid him from view. Her disgrace had temporarily turned the vulturine interest away to other more prominent characters. Even so, it would not be prudent to be seen whispering with her countrymen. When Maris had news gleaned from among the servants, he met her in this deserted corner of the house to bring it while hidden from sight. Aldred fretted within herself at the inactivity. Surely Hikan was part of Malik's grand scheme, and the work he was doing here had to be related to the swarm Vengus had mentioned. Time was trickling by, and she still had no inkling of what was really happening at Frain's Point. The hundreds of slaves and their sad plight would not give her any peace. What was his intention for them? Could something be done to aid them? She could not simply sit idly by while so many were suffering. They did no work of significance that she could discern. Hikan could not afford feeding them indefinitely. Something was to be done with him soon, but what? Now Maris whispered the rumors circulating among the servants to her. A horrible, if fantastic picture took on shape in her imagination, and there were things that he had seen for himself that were more than rumors. Slaves were led away at least once a 10-day, never to return. Some said they were taken into the caverns, into the darkness there, to disappear without a trace. No one was allowed close to the caves. Hekan's guards would not hesitate to strike down anyone who tried to get a glimpse inside. But they could not stop the sound. Screaming was heard on many occasions, drifting from deep underground, and then the fear would rise with it, till the strongest, most resolute of men stopped up their ears and trembled like dry reeds. There was much boasting among the watchers. They took things from the bodies of the dead and gambled over them. Maris had seen the quartz embedded in the sharpened eye-tooth of a marsh-dweller slave. Within 2 days of his disappearance, a guard had worn the stone, tooth and all, on a string round his fat neck as a trophy. He showed it off to others, smiling, joking. Something was kept in the caverns, out of sight, feeding on the bodies of hapless slaves. Something with an appetite for human flesh. Something important enough to warrant this huge gathering in a place as desolate and isolated as Frain's Point. And over time it would consume the thousands brought here against their will. Aldred knew what that something could be. She had seen pictures as a little girl of the terrible creatures that had made up the swarm. The people of Ligurium had forgotten about them. She remembered the cozy little fright one could still get out of looking at the drawings, secure in the knowledge that such things no longer walked the face of Myril. And how horrid they were to a child, the spindly legs, the long claws of the right hand, the skull-like face with a sunken nose. But worst of all was the deformed left hand, shaped like a pike, bony and fingerless, with a row of hooks running on its edge to the elbow. One could imagine this tearing, stabbing razor punched through one's abdomen, while the snarling fangs sought to tear one's throat, and the wicked claws prevented escape. The little girl fear swelled in her now to become a grown woman's terror. She would have to see it for herself. She had to be certain that these were not just rumors. What she would do about it if they were not, she had little idea. But for once, she was in a position to find evidence to silence the speculation of her mind. It took 3 days to work up enough courage. The second watch had barely started, and sounds of music and laughter still escaped the brightly lit tents of Hekan's house. The cold had closed its hand about the city already, till only those who ardently wished for a little privacy away from prying eyes braved the outdoors. Kira and a companion were on their way to distract the guards. They each carried a heavy urn of fragrant water with obvious difficulty. The 3 men sitting outside the entrance to the nearest cave watched impassively. They knew that the indigo-veiled girls of the house were beyond their reach. Still they looked on with scarcely disguised longing. If the 2 would but give some sign, Hekan would not be concerned with what he did not know about. As they passed, the girls peeped out at the guards, and Kira let her veil slip ever so slightly. When she was sure their eyes were fixed on her, she managed to trip and spill water from her overfilled jar. All 3 rushed forward to aid her, but to no avail. The heavy jar crashed to the ground, smashed to pieces, and the girl who carried it dropped to her knees, making little sounds of distress. Helping her to her feet, sending her on her way, and standing about awkwardly and with obvious disappointment, took but a few moments. Yet there was more than enough time for a shadowy figure to slip into the deeper darkness behind them. Aldred's heartbeat was completely out of control, drumming against her ribs till she heard nothing else. Or perhaps there was something. The rapid breathing of an animal, long deprived of air, rasping from her mouth in clouds of steam. Was it too late to turn around? Her feet were suddenly clumsy, her grip on the unlit torch faltering. She ought to have sent Maris in here. It was only a matter of time before she was discovered. What would that madman do to her? What possible excuse could she offer him? She was swathed in layers of dark clothing. Only her eyes could be seen through a slit in her veil. The soft slippers would not make a sound unless she stumbled in the dark. For the night's work she had brought little with her, a torch and flint, and a short dagger Kira had slipped her before she left with her water pot. Not that she had any intention of using it. There was little she would be able to accomplish against the creatures if they were half as dangerous as she suspected. The cavern wall was surprisingly smooth, as if countless hands had touched it in just the same way, while their owners had made their way into the dark beyond. There was a smell, faint yet pungent, unpleasant, suggestive, a reek of briny waters that never saw the sun, fed by salts from the rock in which they pooled. The light from the outside torches faded as she crept forward, her hand to the wall of the narrow passage. Oddly enough, the cold was not as intense inside as out. The silence was complete. Were the monsters asleep? Would she wake them with her foolish intrusion, her sharp striking of flint and sudden bright light? It was impossible to proceed without a lit torch. Haldred huddled behind a protrusion of rock, where the passage widened into a chamber, and waited for her pulse to slow to an acceptable rate. She breathed deeply, convincing herself that there could be no monsters loose in the caverns, for they would certainly have escaped through the unbarred opening by which she had entered. Ahead of her, down the passage, a light welled up. Someone was approaching. She placed a hand over her mouth and pressed herself against the rock wall. Dragging footsteps came up the incline. The hulking figure of a man bearing a torch came into view. Amidst the rising panic, a thought came to her that this person would not walk about in this place if there were swarmlings lurking in the dark, hungry for blood. The footsteps died away, but still she did not move. Could she not have sent Maris down here? Why did she have to come and look for herself? Haldred kindled the torch. She had come too far to turn back now. A quick scouting of the cave ought to be sufficient. A few steps further, a passage branched off the main one. She halted, sweeping her torch over the floor. Perhaps the guard had left marks in the dust, but there was no dust. The floor was moist stone, sandy in places, littered with animal droppings and hoof marks, for the greater part turning to the side. Did they keep cattle down here? Was that the answer to the whole mystery? Sniffing the air, she turned down the new passage. Certainly, that was an ordinary farmyard smell she detected, mixed with what? Carefully she crept forward, till her way was barred by a mesh-like grill blocking the entire tunnel. There was a gate in it, latched but not locked. It gave easily and swung open without a noise. It was obviously in frequent use. An oddly shaped cavern opened up before her. To the left was a large enclave, low-ceilinged and fenced off to serve as a cattle pen. A few forlorn beasts stood about. They were restless, sensing what she also did, staring at her with pale, sad eyes. The odor of stale, brackish water was suddenly much stronger. Here and there the rough walls glistened in the light of her torch. A dark, stunted, leech-like growth clung to the rock in patches, shifting its shadows in the moving light. Uneven arches pockmarked the sides of the cavern now, their dark mouths leading off to smaller chambers, filled with menacing uncertainty. Once or twice she thought she saw slight movements as she passed by with careful tread. The pathway she was on skirted the left wall of the cave. The floor to the right fell away ere long into shallow pools. Here at last was the source of the smell. Movement caught her eye. Strange beasts were standing in the water, some lying down, or what were they? She lifted the torch to see. Cattle? But these wore coats of velvety black, coats that moved and turned dozens of gleaming vampiric eyes on her and the light of her torch. She dropped it and raised both hands to her mouth to stifle the muffled scream. The image remained even though the darkness had closed in around her. Frantically, she scrambled to gather the torch. Perchance it would keep the horrors away. She turned back the way she had come. A sound rose momentarily above the wild beating of her heart. Was it the gate? An illumination spread from the exit tunnel. No, she could not lose her light now. Haldred stopped, looking around her in near panic. There was a call, questioning, puzzled. The shadow of a walking figure grew on the wall. Dear Pelias' penitence, she could not be caught here. But where to hide in this hole of horrors? Gripping the torch with one hand and her throat with the other, she scampered through one of the arches. She capped the torch and watched it flicker and go out. The smell of it still lingered about her. If the guard should come down this far. Haldred sat in the dark, waiting. If only there was some way to control her imagination, it would not be as unbearably horrible as it was. Little half sobs came from her mouth, despite the fingers she had clasped over it. Perhaps it would be better to give it up and throw herself to Hekan's mercy. At least the guard would help her out of this place, and she could simply plead ignorance. It was but curiosity that had led her down here. What else could it have been? The dragging steps halted next to the cattle pen. There was another call, in the desert language she did not fully understand. Moments dragged by, till she wanted to scream and rave at the man for keeping her in such a position for so long. She bit down on her finger without feeling the pain. When he moved back up the pathway, the light receding with his footsteps, she gripped the flint in readiness, steadying the torch between her knees. Still, her hands were shaking, and she had to strike it 3 times to produce a spark. The torch flared, billowing light about her. The place was cramped, the roof low and uneven, covered with bulbous protrusions, some of which were wiggling of their own accord. They were eggs, black, large, and leathery in texture, instead of being encased in a hard shell. Here and there were openings where a few had hatched. Small bat-like creatures hung from the roof, their gleaming eyes fixed on the torchlight. 1 or 2 fluttered their wings expectantly. Sweet Imran's breath! Could they already smell the blood beating in her body? Would they swarm down on her in their untold hordes to rip and tear the flesh from her bones? Inch by inch she backed out of the hollow, never taking her eyes off the pulsing roof. Thus it was that she never saw the guard who had crept back round the cattle enclosure in the dark. He was perhaps 10 yards away when she turned and the light fell on his bulky figure blocking her escape. Haldred started violently before she realized it was an ordinary man she saw in the glow of her torch. He shouted a challenge, making her jump, and drew a long knife from his belt. Haldred did not hesitate. All thought of surrender fled from her mind. Swiftly she turned and ran down the passage, the steep downward slope aiding her flight. There was another shout as the man leaped after her, soon followed by a curse as he collided with something in the dark. She paid little heed to her surroundings. What dangers the dark concealed no longer mattered. There was a present threat she had to escape first. Haldred ran till she was out of breath before she searched for a hiding place. The stink of the place had become almost overwhelming. There was something sulphurous now mingling with the reek of before. The terrain was similar to that of the first cavern, though loose boulders and fallen rock littered the widening course. She made a quick decision. The guard knew the place well, and she could not hope to elude him for long. Somehow she had to get past him before he summoned help, and they sealed the entrance against her. A huge rock to one side offered temporary shelter. She doused the flame and felt her way onto it in the dark. Already the heavy breathing of her pursuer could be heard round a bend in the pathway. He had stopped to kindle his torch and had fallen slightly behind. No doubt he recognized her as a woman, for he was muttering to himself, put out by the inconvenience of chasing after her more than feeling perturbed by the possible threat. He was sweating in the dank air, swinging his torch about him as if to flush her out. Haldred selected a stone from the rubble around her. It was almost too heavy to lift. The man had his back to her. She reminded herself that he was an enemy, an evil person who would hurt or kill her without a second thought. Still, she shuddered to think of dropping this lethal weight on his head. He was vile, a stinking murderer, helping in the preparation of these horrors that would destroy her home and her people. Could she even do it, even if she knew this for certain? Haldred closed her eyes, cursing her indecision. A far-off scream pierced through her to the marrow, finding an echo in her own throat. It took all her resolve not to let go of the stone and rushed off in mad flight. Nothing but a man could make such a noise. The cry of the condemned, tossed to a terrible death. Other sounds rose about her, the snarling of wild beasts, and unbelievably distant laughter. She looked down, straight into the eyes of the man below. In one swift motion, born of fear and desperation, she shoved the heavy stone over the edge. He saw it coming and moved to evade it, but he was too slow. The stone struck him a glancing blow on the shoulder, finally dropping onto his left foot. Haldred scrambled down, his cry of pain and rage ringing in her ears. He swung at her with the knife, though she was obviously out of reach. There was no time to light the torch, and she took off up the pathway and into the dark once more. The guards stumbled after, swearing. He called out once or twice, probably in an attempt to rouse the guards outside the cave. A plan of escape took shape in her mind. She had to get to a hiding place before they heard the calls from within. The memory of the hole behind the arch made her shudder. She had reached the cattle pen by the time the guards responded to their comrades shouting. Quickly she crouched here, lowering her head. She could see their expressions of concern as they rushed past her. Haldred wasted no time. The men could turn at any moment. There was only the narrow passage ahead, a breathless sprint, and she was out in the cold night air, giddy with relief. Kira clasped both her hands as she entered the tent. Her anxious eyes sought Haldred's. Her voice was timid and afraid, like that of a little girl.
What did you find in there? What did you see? I thought you would never come out again.
Haldred was still trembling. A nervous laugh escaped her.
You would not believe me if I told you.
Look at you. You are terrified. Is it true what they say, that it is the gate to the underworld?
The large eyes begged her for reassurance. It was strange to see this sprightly girl without a smile for once.
Perhaps it is, though the horrors there are much more than spirits. They are real enough, and they have a taste for the flesh and blood of men.
Kira released her hands and reached up to her own face in shock. Haldred placed her hands on both sides of the girl's face.
Thank you, Kira. I could have done little without your help tonight.
In silence, the girl turned away. Finally, while helping Haldred to disrobe, she said in a low voice,
What will you do?
Haldred thought of her father, her family, of Rune and Malvor in Breck. She thought of all the innocents in Amrys, in Arruis, in all the cities up the coast.
There is little I can do, but I know those who can. I must get a warning out to them. I will send a message.
Kira rose to her feet from where she had removed the soft black shoes and looked at their soiled state in disgust.
I will go.
Haldred shook her head.
Thank you, but no. I will need someone who knows his way around Ligerium. Someone who can avoid the wrong people if necessary. And my brother has provided me with just the right person.
Mara's face was cloudy. He seemed dismally unhappy. Haldred misunderstood the reason. She pressed him again.
It has to be tonight, Maris. I do not know when they will unleash this horror. The captain in Breck must be warned. They will need time to warn others and make preparations. You see that, don't you? This is for Vengus. This proves him right in front of the whole of Myrol.
He stood in front of her with bowed head, his voice heavy.
Yes, I see that.
Then what is wrong?
He hesitated, uncertain. At last he said,
I hate to leave you here alone.
You cannot protect me here, Maris. Not against all these.
He looked up, his eyes fierce.
I could die trying, but you would have me leave with my oath unfulfilled.
At last she had an inkling of the deep love this young servant had for her brother. In keeping a promise he had made the doomed man, there remained a single opportunity to display that devotion. Haldred was deeply touched. She said with complete sincerity,
But I need you to live for me, Maris, and for the thousands who would need us now. Vengus is dead, but you are here still. Now you must act in his place and carry the warning for which he spent his life and his reputation to convey to others, that they might benefit from that unselfish life that was his.
He could not reply, and she did not say another word. The specter of her brother's misunderstood life loomed very close. Haldred gathered her thoughts.
Speak to no one but the Nurian captain Melvor at Breck. I will give you no written message in case you are caught. You can claim to have wandered off and lost your way in the desert. Perhaps it will save your life. Mention my name and that you are from Hekan's house. Perhaps they will bring you back here. Tell Melvor all you have seen and heard, and what I've told you about the caverns. Tell him it is I that sent this warning, and that he should pass it on to my father and the king of Nuria. If he asks you for proof that I am alive, tell him that there is a Ligurian princess who believes that there is no defense against the swarm except for the lost Viron art.
She drew him towards her and kissed him on the forehead.
All my hopes go with you. If we do not meet again, you have my deepest gratitude for Arid, for Vengus, and for this great sacrifice. Farewell, Maris.
Still overcome with emotion, the young man did not reply. Instead, he slung the water skins and food bundle over his shoulder and drew his dark cloak closer about him against the cold. He would travel only at night and find a hiding place during the day. His peculiar position in the house ensured that he would hardly be missed. If all went well, he would be in Breck in 6 days. His mind was set. As soon as Melvor dismissed him, he would make his way back to Frain's Point. Haldred watched the fleeting shadow till he was lost in the dark. A feeling of futility settled over her. Hekan would have patrols out to prevent escapes. Maris could not carry enough water to last him through the desert. Still, the longer nights would give him more traveling time, and once he sighted the eastern ranges of Lysan, the first villages would be within reach. She looked at the lowering eyes of Lauren slanting down to the western horizon, and prayed to everything she could think of that he would be successful. Fengor regarded Duke Perian of Ambrus as a cat would a trapped mouse. No doubt the newly appointed Ligurian diplomat felt it too, for he seemed to shift in his seat every time he had to say something. Turik's attempt at toughening up his negotiating team had thus far been a dismal failure. The king of Nuria smiled to himself as Talon struck another blow. The old quester's hunting instinct was even more refined than his.
And yet, your king-to-be does not object to the threatened security of his southern border. Not after your own brother was slain almost within sight of a Ligurian town.
Perian wilted under the formidable stare of the High Quester. He had delivered Turik's objections to the Nurian annexation of Lysan, but was hard-pressed to defend them. With the embarrassing Ligurian record in the south, there was little on which to stand. He made another feeble attempt. If he returned empty-handed, Turik would flame alive.
Malik's raiders are out of control. He did not keep his part of the bargain. We admit that Julos lost his head, lost his nerve. The mutiny frightened him into making a dash for Nicoma, but then he did not know that it had been orchestrated, and there should not have been raiders that far north.
Talon was in a lethal mood. He sneered down at the Ligurians.
Should not, might not, ought not. All you have to offer are these pathetic excuses for the continued disaster in Lysan. Can you hear the laughter in the court of Aaron? How are we to stand against their deprivations when your actions steal their resolve 100-fold? Tell me, Duke, how does Ligurium propose to govern a newly conquered people without a governor or a single soldier to police them? Do not speak here of bargains and who kept what, when Ligurium cannot hold to the simplest of arrangements. It would seem to those less trusting that you are deliberately breaking faith with us.
He spoke the last few words with a menacing tone. Perian was on the defensive immediately.
No, you cannot accuse.
Callan gave him no chance.
Accuse? No one is accusing anything. I am merely pointing out the facts of the matter, as separated from the suppositions. And the facts are that Ligurium is currently incapable of governing Lysan. Nuria will keep it in trust till matters change.
He looked about him with an air of mock relief.
Well, I assume that concludes matters. I am glad the little misunderstanding has been cleared up. Thank you, Duke Perian, and may I congratulate you, if a little belatedly, on your appointment as head diplomat of the future king of Ligurium.
His false little smile remained in place, while the Nurians rose to their feet and prepared to leave. Perian and his delegation did likewise, though here there was not even a pretense of goodwill. Something had soured the Nurian attitude towards Turik. Their new strong-arm tactics were disconcerting, and in stark contrast to the smiling, companionable mood of a few seasons before. Perian had a difficult report to make to his superior. Nuria still backed Turik's claim to the throne, but reservedly, and their aid, it now appeared, came at great cost. Furthermore, a sinister, insidious element had crept into the relationship, something that did not bode well for future cooperation. Ligurium was fast becoming a satellite rather than an ally. Since early rhyme song, calls for Tregoran's abdication had been heard in the larger towns of Ligurium. After the series of recent disasters, the weather could not turn cold without their old king being to blame, and so many worse things than bad weather still plagued the land. Despite Turik's intervention, there was yet a shortage of grain and most other foodstuffs throughout the large towns and cities. Riots still occurred every other day, and large places of entertainment were closed in a desperate attempt to prevent the congregation of significant numbers of people. Experience had taught them that these gatherings could soon develop into ugly scenes of violence and protest. The now deserted arena in Arius was just another boost for Tregoran's increasing unpopularity. By the beginning of Frostflood, a curfew was in place in Arius and Varus. Especially in the capital, the mood was ugly, and the taverns had become gathering places for mobs who demanded the stepping down and even banishment of the king. Tregoran sat in customary indecision. Even his advisors were divided. Old stalwarts like Perian and Turik seemed to have given up all hope and were gently pressing for an abdication before things got out of hand. Still, there were others who assured him that his house yet enjoyed widespread support among the rural towns and farmsteads. Any attempt to depose him would be strongly opposed from these quarters. Amidst the ill tidings, the pressures and rumors, there was little time to concern himself with the report of his youngest daughter's capture and possible death. Julos' body had been found, but of Haldred and his grandson there was no trace. He knew what horrors could befall a captured woman at the hands of raiders and mercenaries. There had been little time also to grieve for the loss of Vengis. His only son had been crushed, as part of Morland's invasion force in the Tristwood more than 6 seasons previously. He could still remember the day that he had heard the news. It was like a physical blow that had robbed him temporarily of motion and the power to think clearly. Deluded, ridiculed, and shunned for his wild beliefs, the man that should have been his heir, the boy who had always been a little too serious, lay dead in a foreign field, his talents unappreciated, his achievements unrecognized. The tragedy of it had tugged at his reason, and for a long time he would not even consider someone else as successor. There was Turik, of course, ambitious, able enough, yet something deterred him from naming his nephew as heir. Something dark and ruthless in the man's character did not recommend him as a royal. Now the issue had suddenly come to a head. The men of his council were wavering, fearful even. They had failed him, made his administration ineffective, and sat before him as if he was the only one to blame for the incompetence. Why had they not foreseen the looming shortages earlier in the cycle? Why had their judgment fallen short when the bold stroke against Lysan was planned? Had he not advised against it? Was he not the only one who had opposed it? But no one would remember his voice of dissent, only that he had hesitated to act against the raiders. He looked down in bitterness at his aging hands. Depressed silence reigned. Not one member would look at the other. Finally, Turik seemed to make up his mind. His voice had an edge to it, as if he was issuing a challenge.
This is the end.
The king looked at him sharply.
What do you mean by that?
Several forms round the table shifted uncomfortably. Turik spoke with his eyes fixed on the center of the table.
Tregoran, we have run out of time. If we do not act now, there may be a general uprising.
Act. And what are we to do?
Step down. Name me as your heir. I swear to you that I will restore the reputation of the family, and yours with it.
There was no protest from the other lords. Not a voice was raised to contest the preposterous challenge. None of them would even meet his eye.
And if I should refuse? There are 10 good cycles ahead of me as king, before I'm required to step down by law.
Turik's face twisted in exasperation.
Good cycles. 10 of them. You mean cycles as good as this one? And how many of them will you have after the mob has broken into the palace, demanding your head?
Tregoran's eyes narrowed. He would not be threatened in his own home.
Do not try to blame me for all the misfortunes that have befallen Ligerium. Most every decision made was ratified by these lords present.
He knew it was a mistake, but no longer cared.
You advised me to appoint that bungling fool Morland as commander in Lysan.
There were eyes on him now. Few of the lords had seen their king so intensely roused. Turik, however, was closing in for the kill. He spread his arms mockingly.
Make an announcement. Step outside and tell the good people that your advisors betrayed you, that you did not mean to place your seal on the order to appoint Morland, that you believed the threat to be serious, but could not bring yourself to spurn the words of other old men of wavering resolve. See if they will demand the heads of your council and not yours.
He folded his arms and smiled smugly.
No, my liege. The evil that plagues Ligerium has gained a face, and it is yours.
Tregoran was suddenly beside himself with rage.
You viper! It is indeed the end if I have to be subjected to this slander in my own council room. So this is the way it is. I will not be too amazed if you have planned it thus.
He rose to his feet.
And you!
He pointed round the table at the downcast faces.
You sit in silent endorsement of this treachery. Fine lords you turned out to be, conspiring with a lowly adventurer to supplant your king. What did he pay you? How much for your treason? Tell me that you took something of value at least. Tell me you did not accept only a mere promise from this twister. You will never see the gold.
Turik had turned red. His voice thundered in the chamber, cutting off the raving king.
Enough!
He reached down to his waist, touching the jeweled hilt of his ornamental sword. Tregoran stared at him as if he had gone insane.
What? Would you cut me down in my own palace? Have you lost your reason?
Hold your tongue! I swear you will regret the next word you speak to me.
Turik leaned his hands on the table.
You have had your 10 cycles of mediocrity. Be content. In fact, be relieved that the results you see around you had not come sooner, or that the freak of a son you sired did not come to the throne in due course.
Tregoran glanced round him helplessly. All the lords, even Perian, had their eyes fixed on Turik. He knew where their loyalties lay. Perhaps he could escape this chamber with his life and find a loyal guard to aid him. He slumped back in his seat. Turik relaxed a little.
Now to terms. I am a reasonable man, and I have no personal score against you. Speak your convenience.
Tregoran's voice was tired and resigned.
The Queen and I would like to retire to Varus as we have planned. None remain of my children should be harmed in any way. The royal estates in Pernacum and Nimona, with the exception of the coastal properties in the north, will be forfeited to the new king. Those, you understand, is to provide for us now.
He felt like a beggar. Turik had reduced him from a king to a beggar within the duration of a single watch. The new king smiled in satisfaction. His voice had lost all threat and warning of violence.
Before all these witnesses present, I agree to your terms and add 2 conditions.
Tregoran raised his eyebrows. Turik continued.
You will never speak of what transpired in this room today. You will never cast me in a bad light or subvert my authority in any way.
Tregoran nodded resignedly, as if this went without saying. Turik pursed his lips.
That is settled then. Perian.
The Duke of Estium brought forward a scroll and placed it on the table in front of Tregoran. Another lord placed an inkpot and pen next to it. The old king looked from one to the other, then rested his gaze on Perian.
How fitting,
he said. Turik shook his head.
Let's not commence our new era of prosperity with recriminations.
The pen scratched over the paper. There was a collective sigh of relief. All rose to depart. 2 guards entered to escort Tregoran. At the door, Turik grasped the hand of the duke. A mirthless smile played round his lips.
A simple matter, in the end.
Perian frowned.
Varus? There may be enough fools there to organize support for him.
Turik considered this for a moment.
You're right. Instruct the escort to take him and the queen straight to Amorous. The men of your household will secure him there. They should leave before daybreak tomorrow. His chattels can always be sent there afterwards.
An ugly rumor spread through the countryside of Estium. The former king had come to Amorous, a prisoner of his nephew, and was kept in the ducal palace under armed guard. He was allowed no direct contact with his loyal subjects. All communication passed through Turik's lieutenants, and was doubtlessly heavily censored. Groups formed in the towns, electing leaders and brandishing arms. They would march on the provincial capital and demand to see their king. Turik, for all the apparent good that he had done, did not have their blessing as yet. This latest action proved to them that all was not as it appeared in the royal succession. The scheming nephew had not played fair. On the first day of leasing, there was a clash between Turik's men and loyalists in Nimona. The new king's agents had to flee for their lives, leaving behind 2 dead and several severely injured at the hands of the good citizens of that town. Suddenly, the possibility of a civil war loomed on the troubled horizon. Turik's reaction was ruthless and swift. The ringleaders in Nimona were declared outside the law, and prices placed on their heads. All couriers and messengers were ordered to return to their masters unless they carried the royal mark of Turik himself. No one was allowed to cross into or out of the country for reasons other than the transport of emergency rations. A strong contingent of the newly organized Ligurian army was dispatched with all haste to the area of unrest, with orders to suppress the uprising with the utmost violence. Nimona would become an example of the new style of government. Decisive action was needed to erase the memory of Tregoran's inept administration. In Malvor's mind, there was no more doubt. Lysan had been abandoned, and he along with it. The Nurians in their makeshift fort were stranded outside Nicoma on the Ligurian border. Lucain had stripped them down to 400 when he had marched all of the royal guard and the best 100 of those who remained with him back to Nuria in Grey Cost. The little island of men sent out strong patrols to destroy raiding parties or keep an eye on developments in Ligurium. Yet the disturbing events over the border and the seizing of Lysan placed a potentially hostile nation between them and their home. Who knew what crazy scheme Fengor and Talon had hatched to bring about such chaos? And what had they intended for the little force remaining in Lysan? Their instructions had included marching on Arduis, a ludicrous notion at best. Furthermore, it was clear that no instruction could find its way to him now that Ligurium had closed its borders. He was left to his own devices. He smiled ruefully as he gazed over the city of Breck. The palace watchtower had become a favorite place to gain perspective and order his thoughts. The first assignments of stone had arrived from the quarries. The merchants of Breck had been only too willing to accept the king of Nuria's promise of payment. He wondered how long this would last, with the worsening news rolling in every day from the north. Already the masons were at work. The sound of their hammering floated over from the main northern gateway, where the first alterations were to be made. It was good to hear. While Ligurium was threatening to tear itself apart, Lysan was consolidating. And if he had his way, and he planned to, the city of Breck would become a formidable fortress. Wells were being dug within the perimeter of the proposed new walls. Most of the hovels hugging the old enclosure would be moved back by leasing, partly to make room for the excavation of the foundations, partly to improve the present defensive situation. He would throw 2 bastions to the north to flank the gatehouse, and allow for a withering crossfire against a host approaching from that direction. With few natural obstructions to the attacker, he would have to repeat this procedure in every direction around Breck, till the city bristled with defenses, and a successful rush would be impossible to carry off. Yes, if Fengor had decided to throw him this stale bone, he would still make the most of it. Fabian, one of 10 Nurians he had kept in Breck as a bodyguard, cleared his throat behind Malvor. The captain turned, frowning.
What is it?
Forgive the intrusion, sir. A worn-out fellow has just stumbled into the palace, claiming that he bears an urgent message for you.
Malvor took a step forward, his pulse quickening.
From the king? From Ligurium?
Fabian hesitated.
No, sir. He came from the south, the desert. He bears a message from Princess Haldred of Ligurium.
What? This is not just some crazy ploy.
I think it best for you to see him, sir. We will watch him closely, but I think he is beyond any trick in his present condition.
Malvor approached the ladder and started his descent, speaking over his shoulder.
He has the message on him.
Fabian followed close behind.
There is no written message, Captain. That's why we would have you speak with him. He will not say a word to anyone else.
By the time Malvor had joined the excited group in his antechamber, the youthful messenger had collapsed onto a bench. He seemed barely lucid, slowly ingesting water from a cup held for him by one of the guards. His face was haggard and pale, lending authenticity to his claim. Malvor reached out a hand to the guard.
Give me the cup and leave us.
Fabian looked at him questioningly.
Wait outside the door, Fabian, and make sure we are not disturbed. I recognize this man.
When Malvor took the place of the guard, the youth raised up in protest. The Nurian pushed him back onto the bench.
Lie still. You are of no use to me half alive. Empty the cup first, and then tell me what you can.
When the last drop had vanished, and he seemed more at ease, Malvor had him sit up.
You serve Princess Haldred. She's still alive, then?
The reply was hoarse but strong.
She was, sir, when I left her 7 days ago.
Your name?
Maris, sir.
Tell me everything, Maris.
Malvor listened with growing incredulity, though he did not doubt the truth of what the messenger said. When finally he had exhausted the many questions engendered by these unbelievable tidings, he rose to his feet and started pacing up and down. Fengor and his plotting, Turik and his greedy little ploy, all the concerns that had troubled his mind till now had evaporated like mist before the rising sun. He turned to the youth once more.
She gave you proof that I could recognize.
Princess Haldred said that you would know she believes only the lost Viron art can defeat the swarm.
Malvor's mind went back to a certain feast held in this very palace 6 seasons before, and the intriguing conversation with the governor's wife. Yes, she was still alive, but one thing remained.
Was there any indication when this bandit planned to unleash his horde?
Maris looked uncertain.
No, sir. But there was talk of moving the camp by the Darkening.
Malvor's stomach twisted into a knot.
The Darkening? But we are in leasing already. That leaves fewer than 30 days.
He thought of the ill-prepared forces of Lysan, of his men sitting exposed on the border, of his fortifications barely begun, of his retreat cut off by the hostile Turik. Then he thought of Fengor, of Nuria, of Ligurium still ignorant. Messengers would have to be sent this same hour. He turned back to the half-forgotten youth.
Fabian will see you cleaned up and find a place for you to sleep. I want to see you as soon as you wake tomorrow morning.
He helped Maris to his feet.
And not a word of this to a soul.